The anatomy of the spinal cord. The spinal cord begins superiorly at the foramen magnum in the skull, and it ends inferiorly in the adult at the level of the lower border of the L1 vertebra, while in the young child it is relatively longer and usually ends at the upper border of L3 vertebra. It is surrounded by three meninges: the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Cerebrospinal fluid which surrounds the spinal cord is in the subarachnoid space. The fusiform enlargements at the level of the brachial plexus in the cervical region and the lumbar plexus in the lumbar region are two in number: the cervical and the lumbar enlargements. The spinal cord ends inferiorly as the conus medullaris, and from the apex of this there's a prolongation of pia mater called the filum terminale, and this descends to be attached to the posterior surface of the coccyx. The deep longitudinal fissure on the anterior surface of the spinal cord is called the anterior median fissure. There is also a shallow furrow at the posterior surface called the posterior median sulcus. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves which arise from the cord by the anterior or motor roots and the posterior or sensory roots. Each posterior nerve root has a posterior root ganglion. The spinal cord has an inner core of gray matter which is surrounded by an outer covering of white matter. On a cross section, you would see the gray matter as an H-shaped pillar with anterior and posterior gray horns or columns, which are united by a thin gray commissure. This contains the small central canal. A small lateral gray horn is also present in the thoracic and the upper lumbar segments of the cord. The white matter. This is divided into anterior, lateral, and posterior white columns or funiculi. The anterior column on each side lies between the midline and the point of emergence of the anterior nerve roots. The lateral column lies between the emergence of the anterior nerve roots and the entry of the posterior nerve roots. The posterior column lies between the entry of the posterior nerve roots and the midline. It consists of a mixture of nerve fibers, neuroglia, and blood vessels. It surrounds the gray matter, and its white color is due to the high proportion of myelinated nerve fibers. The ascending tracts. The first order neurons have the cell bodies in the posterior root ganglion of the spinal nerve. The second order neuron gives rise to an axon that decussates, which crosses over to the opposite side and ascends to a higher level of the central nervous system where it synapses with the third order neuron. And the third order neuron is usually in the thalamus, and it gives rise to a projection of fibers that passes to the sensory region of the cerebral cortex. Pain and temperature pathways. The receptors for pain are in the skin, and they are free nerve endings. Pain impulses are transmitted to the spinal cord in fast-conducting delta A-type fibers and slow-conducting C-type fibers. The fast-conducting fibers alert the individual to an initial sharp pain. The slow-conducting fibers are responsible for prolonged burning and aching-type pain. The sensations of heat and cold also travel by delta A and C fibers. In the medulla, lateral spinal thalamic tract lies near the anterior spinal thalamic tract and the spinotectal tracts, and together they form the spinal lemniscus. The spinal lemniscus continues to ascend through the posterior part of the pons, and in the midbrain it lies in the tegmentum, lateral to the medial lemniscus. From there it goes to the ventral posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. The axons of these third-order neurons from the thalamus pass through the posterior limb of the internal capsule and the corona radiator to reach the somasthetic area in the post-central gyrus of the cerebral cortex. For light or crude touch and pressure pathways, you have the anterior spinothalamic tract. In the upper cervical segments of the cord, the sacral fibers are most lateral and cervical segments are mostly medial. The axons enter the spinal cord from the posterior root ganglion and they proceed to the tip of the posterior gray column in the medulla. They form the spinal lemniscus along with the lateral spinothalamic tracts and the spinotectal tracts. And the spinal lemniscus proceeds to the thalamus, which proceeds to the cerebral cortex. For fine touch, vibration, and joint position sense, you have the posterior white column. The fasciculus gracilis is present throughout the length of the spinal cord and contains the long ascending fibers from the sacral, lumbar, and lower 6 thoracic spinal nerves. The fasciculus cuneatus is situated laterally in the upper thoracic and cervical segments of the cord and contains long ascending fibers from the upper 6 thoracic and all the cervical spinal nerves. These fibers ascend ipsilaterally and terminate by synapsing on the second order neurons in the nuclei gracilis and cuneatus of the medulla oblongata. The axons of these, called the internal arcuate fibers, decussate with the corresponding fibers at the opposite side at the sensory decussation in the middle level of the medulla, and they ascend as the medial lemniscus. This terminates by synapsing on the third order neurons in the ventro-posterolateral nucleus of the thalamus. From the thalamus, it proceeds to the sensory cortex. The corticospinal tracts arise from the pyramidal cells, that's the layer 5 of the cerebral cortex, from the areas 4, which is the primary motor cortex, 6, which is the secondary motor cortex, the sensory cortex 3, 1, and 2. And from here, it goes to the corona radiata, to the internal capsule, to the crus cerebri of the midbrain, to the basal pons, to the pyramids, where they decussate. And the fibers that cross over proceed downward as the lateral corticospinal tract. The uncrossed fibers are the anterior corticospinal tract. They finally cross over, and they reach the alpha and gamma motor neurons of the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. From there, the fibers go to the motor nerve roots, from there to the spinal nerve, and from there to the muscle. Other descending tracts in the spinal cord are vestibulospinal, tectospinal, rubrospinal, olivospinal, and reticulospinal tracts. To summarize, you have descending tracts on the left side, ascending tracts on the right side. The descending tracts would be primarily lateral and anterior corticospinal tracts, rubrospinal tract, olivospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract, tectospinal tract. And the ascending fibers would be fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus posteriorly, lateral and anterior spinocerebellar tracts laterally, lateral and anterior spinothalamic tracts, spino-olivary tract, spinotectal tract, reticulospinal tract. The nerve cell groups in the anterior gray columns. There are alpha efferents, which innervate the extrafusal skeletal muscles, and the gamma efferents, which innervate the intrafusal muscle fibers of the neuromuscular spindles. The nerve cell groups in the posterior gray columns. There are 4 nerve cell groups, 2 that extend throughout the length of the cord and 2 that are restricted to the thoracic and lumbar segments. The substantia gelatinosa group is situated in the apex of the posterior gray column, and it's composed of Golgi type 2 neurons. And these receive afferent fibers concerned with pain, temperature, and touch from the posterior root. The nucleus proprius. This is a group of large nerve cells situated anterior to the substantia gelatinosa throughout the spinal cord. It receives nerve fibers from the posterior white column that are associated with proprioception, 2-point discrimination, and vibration. The nucleus dorsalis, also called the Clark's column, is a group of nerve cells situated at the base of the posterior gray column, extending from C8 segment to L4 segment. It is associated with proprioceptive endings of the neuromuscular spindles and the tendon spindles. The visceral afferent nucleus. This is a group of nerve cells lateral to the nucleus dorsalis, and it extends from T1 to L3 segment of the spinal cord and receives visceral afferent information. The nerve cell groups in the lateral gray columns. The intermediolateral group of cells from the small lateral gray column, which extends from T1 to L3 segments. The cells are relatively small and they give rise to preganglionic sympathetic fibers.